Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, good afternoon. It's bang on 12 o'clock or high noon. Welcome to Trueman Change's latest webinar. We're absolutely delighted to see quite a few people joining us on time. That's what we like to see, even though it's a Friday afternoon and we like to do things in a little bit more of a laid-back way. We'll give it a minute or so just for everybody to join. Thank you very much for coming to see us today. My name's Rachel Walker. I'm Principal Consultant at Trueman Change. Joining me this afternoon is Darius Ward. Darius is new to Trueman Change. So we thought it would be a great opportunity to hear from Darius in terms of one of the specialties that he has. We've just got a few other people coming into the webinar just now, so welcome. Today we're here to talk about common obstacles that we find in our experiences as consultants working with local government in the UK. Darius is going to be sharing his pearls of wisdom. Now, the meeting or the webinar is being recorded. However, the delightful sort of Zoom settings gives us the opportunity to really just record me and Darius. So if you do have your camera on, it's great to see everybody this afternoon. Thank you. Your face won't be appearing on the recording, fear not. So you can pull as many faces as you like and it won't dent your professional relationships with us. Thank you again for joining us. We do have a few more people coming in. So today we're going to talk about common obstacles that we face. We've got one of the pre-webinar things that we sent out was the opportunity to ask us questions. And I've got a few questions from our audience in anticipation of the webinar this afternoon. And I'm going to go through a few of them and give Darius the opportunity to answer in his wealth of experience in terms of delivery. At Trueman Change, we are the greatest little consultancy in the whole wide world as far as I'm concerned, and we're the leading change management consultancy in the north of England. Darius and I are both Lancastrians, and you're in for an absolute northwest treat in terms of our accents this afternoon. We're going to go through the common obstacles that we face around delivery. The outline is I'm going to ask Darius a few questions. We have some questions for the audience, but we do have the chat open. So if you haven't had a chance to submit a question ahead of this afternoon, please feel free to use the chat to chat amongst yourselves, to contribute, to agree or disagree with anything that we have to say this afternoon. We are really open and genuinely welcome to challenge. It's what makes it all a bit more fun. So Darius, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi Rachel, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. As Rachel said, my name is Darius Ward. I'm a fellow principal consultant now here with Trueman Change. I got started in working in and for local government at Blackburn with Darwen Borough Council, for anyone who may have heard or come across that particular authority. That was back in 2005. It wasn't long, less than a couple of years. I then moved into the consulting arena and have worked extensively with Northwest authorities and further afield too. More recently, bringing it a little more up to date, I've worked with Leeds City Council and Jimmy's Hospital on a project that was very much related to the topic that we're covering today. And also have worked in partnership with the various collaboratives and departments of the Lancashire Health Trust as well.
Fantastic, thank you. We already have a comment already saying I'm from Lancashire County Council, loving the local references and accents. Big up the Lancashire massive this afternoon. So Darius, at Trueman Change we do all sorts, delivery partnerships as well as evaluation, learning partnerships. We do change in all its various guises, and we work to deliver projects, programs, and change. Now, within any new undertaking, what are some of the first areas that you would look at? Now, we're talking about delivery obstacles here, and we probably know what they are in terms of, you know, everybody here is working with local government, but we'd love to hear from your experience what kind of delivery obstacles you've come across in your work.
Okay, so the approach that we take at Trueman Change, I'm quickly gathering, and I'm pleased to say it aligns with my own, is that we need to obviously tailor any solution, and that applies obviously to you as trained change practitioners or heads of service or whatever your role may be, but also obviously us as consultants working at the side of you on the occasions that we do. So first and foremost, we would need to look at capacity. Now, it's no surprise at all whatsoever that capacity is a constant issue in service delivery. So perhaps stating the obvious a little, but nonetheless, both mathematically and qualitatively, we need to take a look at that capacity, because at the end of the day, of course, if you only have 10 people and there's 12 lots of work to do, you're probably going to be struggling to deliver the service. And that's something that needs to be assessed and to be considered very carefully. But also it can be the case that there is, of course, these things that occur over time, such as job creep and picking up extra responsibilities. And, you know, when you go down from 3 to 2 in a particular team or service or function, then, you know, normally that 3 lots of work is spread across 2 people and can create that sort of strain. So sometimes, and in fact, very often, it pays to just take a look at that and to assess exactly where that is. And like I say, I do mean that in a quantitative way. So the number of hours, the units and that kind of thing, but also, of course, that qualitative element in as much as how people feel the stress and the strain that is present and a number of other factors as well. Second, we would then look at the demand. So we know that we have, you know, X amount of capacity, whether that's the full-time equivalents, whether it's the number of people in post, whether it's the variety of different skills and things like that. But we also need to then, of course, take an assessment of the demand. Now, that again is something that can change over time. So there is sort of commonly held wisdom within authorities and organisations of all type, for that matter, in as much as, you know we need to do X amount per year or quarter or month, or that this is the busy time or this is the quiet time, and, you know, all that kind of thing. And of course that serves very well, but of course also it can change over time. So it pays dividend, I find, quite often, to sort of press the pause button as much as it's of course feasibly possible, to take a snapshot both of the current activity and how it's perhaps changed over time, and then to map then in the first instance what you've got, i.e. the capacity, and how much you can actually do with that, i.e. the demand that's being placed upon the service. And then finally, the third thing I would look at is how can that be better aligned? So quite often there can be, of course, that disparity. In fact, 99 times out of 100, there's a disparity between the capacity and demand, creating the obstacle to the provision of service, or the effective provision of service at least. And so is it a case of there is a skills gap? There might be a skills shortage, there may be a surplus in some areas, there may be too much of one and too little of another. It may be that there is actually a scheduling issue. So I know certainly within sort of social care settings and you know, social workers and things like that, they can obviously there's a need to meet the team's sort of requirements in terms of flexible working patterns and things like that, all of which of course is perfectly fine, but nonetheless needs to be considered, because it may be when delivering that, especially a, you know, a 6-7 day a week service, that there is a need, or there is a blockage being created because there's too few on a Tuesday and far too many on a Friday, or whatever it might be. And that's a hyper simplified example. Of course, these are really multifaceted and quite complex things that need to be sort of peeled one layer at a time and revealed for what they are. And then, of course, in some instances, so removing perhaps into sort of teaching and schools and, you know, things where there are large sort of operational issues to consider, then it can be a resource issue. So it could be about classrooms, it could be about the, you know, of course, the teachers are the vital thing and the linchpin of that particular service in terms of delivery and operational direction, but also, you know, what other issues are there. So I'm sure we all remember, I certainly know from my childhood, about the porter cabins that were portable or temporary, should I say, sort of teaching units. And then, you know, they were still there 15 and 20 years later, perhaps in some instances still are. So that would be one actually really good example of where something is done. It's great that it's been identified. There's a capacity, there's a statement and an identification of what the capacity is, what the demand, the increased demand in this instance is being placed upon that service, and then something's put into place. But of course, as with all things, especially porter cabins, they become rather drafty and leaky after a good few years of children stomping in and out and teachers too, for that matter, of an occasion. And so then, a longer term plan might need to be developed for that.
I remember my art and design A level, I thought I was being very edgy by painting the porta cabins outside the windows. And I'm pretty confident they are still there in some cases. Thank you, Darius. So we've done the maths, we've spoken to the humans, and we're trying to, we've done what we can to bring clarity to the incredibly complex world in which we operate in public services. And it is that complexity. And we talk now more about networks and systems and the interconnectivity of integrated services and the sheer complexity of what we would call sort of policy layering and activity layering, where we do an awful lot of things, but unlike the sort of coin slot machines where we expect things to fall off the edge, nothing ever really does. And we're teetering on the edge of collapse, but never quite getting there. Now, having identified what we need, where we need it, and what we want to achieve, what then do we need to do in order to make that happen? What's next?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the tendency, especially when it's all the ladies and gents out there that are actually delivering the service, that are leading these services, whether it's strategically or operationally, and the tendency and the completely sort of normal human condition is to almost, well, let's get through this week, let's get through this fiscal quarter, let's wait until, you said it really well, actually, Rachel, the other day, let's get through the next election cycle. And, these are all things that can cause delays. And so what I like to do, and I know, I'm hoping that you'll agree with me on this point, Rachel, is that, whilst we, as much as is feasibly possible, that's a really quite large caveat, but as much as feasibly possible, pressing pause and taking stock and having that period evaluation, rather than thinking about, well, how can we do the next thing? It's to actually almost start with a blank piece of paper and say, well, in an ideal world, let's forget about what we have and how much we can do and blah, blah, blah. This is just an exercise. It's a paper-based exercise just for a moment in time, half a day's time, perhaps something like that in a workshop environment. How would we design the perfect service? How are we going to be not only fit for purpose now, but to address any sort of legacy issues, but also how we're going to move forward so that we are fit for purpose long into the future until the next time we take opportunity to look at it. And so by looking at that sort of perfect service and what would, all the different facets and the additional services or the increase in this, or perhaps even the reduction of the other, as the case may be, and then having already identified exactly what the capacity is, how much you have, and also what the demand is, what's being placed upon that, you can then take any additional that may be there or create additional through the skills gaps or the skills matrix for training and development, organizational or workforce plans, all those kind of things that of course come from these pieces of work, and apply that to see how far towards, in reality, in a stretching way, but not in an overly burdensome or unrealistic way, how much progress can be made towards that. And then having that sort of ideal state, which of course itself will change over time, but having that ideal state almost up on the wall, so that every time it comes to refresh this sort of this area that we're talking about, then it's always moving towards that guiding light.
I'd have to absolutely agree. The workshops that we do around the perfect service are some of the best ones that I'd love to take part in, because it gives us that opportunity to forget about the day-to-day just for a minute and say, right, build it from scratch. What would you do? And the creativity and the genuine vision and change that comes out of some of the leaders that we've got, if they can suspend belief and reality just for half a day to say, if I was doing this from scratch, oh, it would look completely different. And then we said, well, let's get as close to this as we possibly can. And if we had this perfect service, the crucial question I love to ask is, what would be different? What would be different if in this perfect service we are able to deliver for our residents? What will be different for residents? What will be different for staff? What will be different for us as change leaders? And, bringing out the art of the possible stops that negative thinking of, if it wasn't for this, we'd change. If it wasn't for that, we'd change. If it wasn't for budgets, we'd change. If it wasn't for elections, we'd change. And actually, the art of the possible is a really powerful visualizing tool to help people to realize just exactly what they do need and how far away from that perfect vision we actually are. It's a really, really interesting workshop to run, and it's a visual exercise that we can do with ourselves at any point. You know, if this was a perfect delivery webinar, what would we do from scratch? If this was a perfect customer services front desk when we were building this from scratch, what would we have? And even if you can then tease out 30, 40, 50% of the ideal components of that vision and build that into the reality that you've got, then you're way closer to that vision than you could possibly have imagined, if the starting point is, if it wasn't for this. And one of the questions we have later, Darius, is around that political uncertainty at the moment around elections, and we'll address it later. But I always quite flippantly say, if local government was a movie poster, the strap line at the bottom will be after the elections. You know, it's this sort of this constant narrative of stalling change for perfectly legitimate reasons, and, you know, for reasons that do genuinely prevent innovation and creativity. So thank you, Darius. I'm very much in agreement. Now, we're still within this theoretical space at the moment. So like I say, we've done the maths, we've talked to the humans, we've identified and just sort of got people in a room and said, if you were doing this from scratch, what would your perfect service look like? And how does that align with the reality that you're experiencing? What kind of practical tools, advice, options do you think we have as local government practitioners to bring that vision, to bring reality closer to that vision? What options do we have?
So there's obviously a number of different ways to go about it. So the sort of summary I always think of is either I do, we do, or you do. And often it's quite a combination. It can be a combination of the three. So in terms of I do, that's I myself, which in reality means we, not to confuse the saying. But it basically means that we can act with you as a delivery partner. We can be, you know, sort of your constant ally and trusted sort of delivery partner. And that can be, of course, in relation to the development of the plan, but also setting in place that sort of continual improvement cycle and project management structure, if that's what's required, so that it's setting you up for success. And then, of course, there's the we do, in my version of the same, which means that we actually sort of make some sort of arrangement where internal resources can be applied in terms of carrying out, you know, large portions of the work. It's really important in some instances to be seen to be the person or people or group or department that is leading that particular change, ultimately, you know, making it more sticky, to use the technical term, more sustainable, to use a more proper one. And then also there is, of course, the you do, which is where we do all the sort of theory, and we press that pause button for half a day at a time, develop that sort of, well, this is in the reality of where we are, this is what you have, this is what you need to do with it, this is what more could potentially be done. Here's you know, a workforce development plan, or any number of other outputs that, of course, can be derived from these pieces of work. And then very much sort of left, you know, leave you with it to deliver that, along with, of course, always a roadmap on the sort of major points of execution. But that isn't to say that the work is done, the documents are handed over, and then it's like, bye-bye, you know, good luck with that. Best of luck, and I'll be elsewhere. We quite often, in fact, Lucy and I were having a conversation. She was sharing that more than 50% of the current and historic workload of Trueman Change is actually with existing clients, with existing customers. And so I suppose in one way that's sort of testament to the fact that we must be doing something right, and also that it wasn't an entirely horrid experience, which is very reassuring, of course, but also that it does make sense in some capacity to involve us further once that initial evaluation, assessment or stock take, in essence, has taken place, which is great.
Okay. Catherine in the chat has raised a really good point, and something that I know I talk about quite often, and it's around purpose. And Catherine's question in the chat is around the why. So what is your why is a great tongue twister to deliver in these sessions. And she says, I can understand the what, where, the when of change. How much of the why is conveyed to people, staff and leaders? How important do you think? I know we talk quite a lot about purpose and clarity. And the best example I use regularly is around the pandemic. I know we don't like to dwell on that so much these days, but the pandemic was very much a switch from we want agile staff working flexibly and horizontally, and, you know, great. But there wasn't a great deal of clarity in that purpose. And then the pandemic came and the language changed to everybody worked from home on Monday. And suddenly we had the agility and flexibility and horizontal working, but it was clarity of purpose that really helped people to get behind and deliver urgent, immediate, needed change. Now, we can't live our lives on a burning platform, and the pandemic was a particular moment in time and a pace that is unsustainable. So now we need to find new ways to convey Catherine's why or purpose within this change. Where does this fit in with the very systematic approach in which we're sort of advocating here?
Well, I suppose it was a little remiss of me to leave out the why. It was very sort of nuts and bolts. But I mean, to answer that question quite directly, the why is actually the most important part, which is maybe sort of stating the obvious. And I have had experience of working with other sort of contracting bodies where the why is not even discussed. And if it's brought up, then, you know, you're sort of looked at like you've got two heads. And it's like, well, the why doesn't matter because everyone has to do what they have to do. And, you know, I just, you know, my personal view is that that's really quite a blind way to look at things. So, of course, the saying goes that when the why is clear, the how is possible, and not before that. And so why is very much sort of conveyed, again, to try and give a sort of non-politician's answer. The why is conveyed to people, staff and leaders at every stage of the process. So we obviously have, as part of our sort of project management framework, a communication plan is involved, of course. It is an integral part. It's not something that's written and put on a shelf. It's an integral part. When we assess and revisit the you know, oversight of each of the projects, then communication is included in that. And not only that, when we're leading engagement sessions, workshops, surveys, all that kind of thing, yes, of course, we do need some of those nuts and bolts questions, which I've already referred to in the sort of previous parts so far today. But also it's to make it clear and evident, not, you know, the benefit that is going to be achieved, and that most often, of course, is benefit for the authority, for the citizens of the borough or the city or region, but also for the actual individual that's having to do the change, the person that's having to change the procedure, take on extra responsibility or change it around or produce reports or engage in sessions. You know, there has to be something in it for them, otherwise it's going to become pretty painful and quite laborious, not only in terms of just simply turning up for a meeting for a chat, but certainly in terms of actually doing something when perhaps, you know, the feeling is there that no one's particularly looking. So it's an absolute sort of integral part, something that's hardwired into the communication plan, but also every form of communication and point of contact that we have.
Absolutely. Humans need purpose. It's as simple as that. We need purpose to do anything. One of the things I like to do as a parent of thankfully 2 children that have passed through this phase now is to pretend to be that annoying child and constantly ask why. Yeah, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And if a leader or somebody who's leading change and trying to communicate this can pass my annoying child test, they stand a much better chance of being able to convey that purpose. So consistently asking why Why? Until, as a parent, you reach your limit and you say, because I said so. As a leader, you don't have that luxury. It's not a luxury, let's face it, but you don't have that luxury, and you don't, in order to get people on board, what many change models will call different things. So a guiding coalition, or a sort of a community of people that are willing to advocate for your change. It's the purpose and your ability to be that internal politician and communicate the purpose of the change, I think is quite an underestimated and undervalued skill in leadership. You are that internal politician, but you must be able to pass the annoying child test. and it's, I can't think of a better name for it than the annoying child test, because we've all been there. Thank you, Darius, and I completely agree. The purpose is absolutely everything, and it is that clarity, and that's where good comms come in. Now, we do have a few questions that we've had submitted beforehand, and thank you, Catherine, for your questions so far. And if anybody else has anything they'd like to ask or contribute, we're very grateful. One of the questions that we had were around new project and new funding allocations. Now, we know that over the last few years, there's been a bit of a shift in the funding paradigm that we're seeing as local government, and there are a lot of quite short notice funds being dropped onto local government from central government for delivery. And again, quite sort of, it's Friday afternoon, so we talk a bit jokingly, we all have about 8 minutes to sort out and deliver new funding. So things like household support fund, winter grants, a lot to do around the cost of living at the moment. One of the delivery obstacles that we have in local government is the extreme short turnaround for things like these central government grants that we need to deliver locally. What are some of the common obstacles that we see local government trying to overcome when trying to deliver things at pace?
Yeah. So, I mean, this sort of lends itself, doesn't it, to the practicalities and the realities. So, we've talked about perfect services and analysis and gaps and that kind of thing, all of which is completely essential to understand the realities of the situation we sit. And then all of a sudden something comes in, an email drops into the inbox. It's like, oh, you have 3 days to turn this around, or oh, there's this whole new legislative piece that's been passed, and now, by the way, you have to do another 50 hours with the 6 hours of resource that you have available, or whatever. And so it was sort of starkly into the realities of the situation now, which is great. I would say common obstacles of that nature are around the decision cycle. So I know we've already sort of touched on this in terms of, it's next election, or they're just new, or they're on the way out, or there's this sort of, mid-term sort of situation going on. There is, of course, the practicalities of holidays and absences and all those kind of things that do or are often sort of pegged as being the cause of delay. Not only that, there is an even sort of bigger issue, and one that there is perhaps a simpler solution to, and that is, of course, culture. So, of course, people like to stay where they are. They like the warmth and the comfort that familiarity brings, and I don't think anyone can be blamed for being that way. I think even we, as sort of best practice ambassadors and consultants, are still, have our regularities that we enjoy and experience too. But the great thing is, of course, that one of the other specialisms that Trueman Change has really been crafting for, best part of a decade, if not in fact longer in Lucy's instance, is around culture mapping, around cultural work, whether that's in relation to sort of quote unquote poor culture, as it's often sort of termed, or if it's actually in terms of around specifically change and change management, innovation, transformation, development, all these things that are in reality sort of often thrust upon us. One of the great little tools that we have to help people take stock with that is the change readiness tool, which I'm sure we can arrange to send a link out for anyone who might find that useful. It's free and readily available on a website, and actually provide you with an assessment of where you are on your change journey and where the particular areas are, where the stopping points are, or the blockages you might be experiencing. And the feedback that we've been having off that has been really great when we've spoke with people and they've filled that in. You know, it's provided great insight and a starting point on what needs to change. I suppose another thing is conflicting strategies. So let's say that you are working within operations as a complete sort of finger in the air, or plugging from nowhere, should I say. And then there's a new corporate strategy, there's perhaps a change of colour within the cabinet, you know, things of that nature. And then it's a case of, well, you know, we've set this 5-year plan and we're well on with it, and we have these operational sort of yearly plans that are refreshed and renewed, and then all of a sudden it almost feels like someone's come in, swiped the lot off the table and said, right, off you go, start again. Well, you know, that of course is going to be incredibly frustrating, and not only that, it's going to be really challenging as well. And again, that's something that we, you know, have experienced. Skills gaps, once they've been identified, I know I've mentioned that a few times, but it seems to fit nicely into this sort of common obstacles category. So if you have to, you know, if you're required to provide 5, say, let's say, key regulatory functions, and then there's sort of 2 or 3 extra things that are down to the particular specific needs of your authority and the citizens of the area, then it may be at one time you have an abundance of incredibly talented and experienced and passionate workers, for lack of a better word, to deliver that service and to care and to nourish the people, the service users that benefit from that. But, you know, people, sadly, including myself, in fact, just as a side note, I went to the orthodontist yesterday and he said, oh, your teeth are doing really great for your age. And that was the first time I ever had that said to me. And I thought, well, that's okay. I'll take myself off to the nursing home and everyone can come and find me there then, shall I? So, you know, time and tide waiteth for no person, as I believe the saying goes. And so as there is sort of that attrition or that dropout rate, isn't there? And then, you know, has that been identified? How is that going to be replaced? Of course, you're never going to replace someone with 30 years experience and that ingrained and tacit knowledge that they have with even 10 brand new people. But of course, you've got to start somewhere. So there can be a piece of work to do around that. And then finally, I would say around the capacity for change. So I know I've covered that in terms of the culture, but sometimes it's actually more operational or systematic. It's simply, well, how do we actually, you know, mechanically, how do we move these parts, these interlaced and interdependent parts? How do we actually make that so that sort of the combination locks line up and the safe is opened?
Okay, thank you. Sorry to hear about the age of your teeth, I guess.
Oh, that's awful, isn't it?
Well, thank you, Darius. There is another question that we've had from participants ahead of the session, and that's around the wider uncertainty politically that we're facing at the moment. Now, the local elections that most English authorities experienced in the last few months have given us more no overall control councils than we've ever seen before. It's a topic that's appearing in industry magazines such as the MJ, the Local Government Chronicle, and we're starting to have a look at the effects of no overall control on our decision making and on change activity and where we stand, because it's quite an unusual position for us to be in for a lot of councils. Some councils have lost a real amount of political stability, whatever colour it was. They may have lost, sort of, I've seen councils change for the first time in a generation in the last couple of months. And there are more councils than ever in no overall control. In the next 12 to 18 months, possibly sooner, possibly later, who knows, we are expecting a general election, which could, in the macro scale, change politically. It's certainly upheaval, and it's certainly something that we're all quite distracted with. In terms of getting change done at the local level, whilst it seems worlds apart, it isn't. It's preventing things from getting done. Because we're, like I say, quite flippantly, after the elections is something as a narrative that we're told and we repeat very constantly in local and central government because it is a political cycle. In terms of getting things done within this uncertain environment, what do you think, Darius, will be the one or two most important things that as change managers and change people we need to be focusing on to get stuff done when all around us is a lot more uncertainty than we're used to?
Well, I mean, there's no change that's more certain than change itself. So change will change, which then changes, and then it changes again, and you know, and that is sort of the nature of the beast, isn't it? So in terms of a couple of points, one is, I suppose, to have that clearly defined business case, so that when sort of political pressures come to change the agenda or whatever, then by having that clear cut and laid out sort of strategy, the plan, and to show how it's being implemented, the impact and the difference that it's making to the citizens or by the affected parties, whoever they may be, then, you know, that's one sort of way to shore off perhaps more sort of service shots, if you will. And then the second is, like I say, that, you know, there's nothing as sure as in change as change itself. And so by implementing and creating a culture and a set of systems and processes, and by that I mean human systems and processes, not necessarily IT or anything else, then when the change does come, then the impact is more minimal. There's not that sort of seizing of the gears that can often be the case, and oh, we'll wait, because it's a case of, well, you know, we're going to carry on in earnest in this particular direction, and if we need to pivot or alter the trajectory slightly to fit in with this sort of new agenda or manifesto, as the case may be, then we can do that more readily.
Thank you. I read in the MJ Municipal Journal this morning around, it's an odd story around Sheffield making an apology over healthy tree culls. Now in Sheffield, apparently, I wasn't familiar with this ongoing saga. They've felled a lot of healthy trees in the thousands, I believe, and residents have understandably been up in arms about it. One of the quotes from the political and administrative leadership was around a loss of trust with residents, and one of the heartfelt apologies that have come out of this is that, yes, we think this has really damaged the relationship that we have with our residents. We've certainly lost a lot of trust, and we think that this is going to take quite a while to recover. Now, having led customer services in a local authority for an awfully long time, I know that there is very little local government, local councils can do to win residents over wholeheartedly. And those godforsaken Facebook groups are an absolute cesspit of criticism. But in all of this, one thing that we haven't kind of touched upon yet is our relationship with residents and with our communities, and what we can do within this political uncertainty as officers to help maintain or build levels of trust around change. We've talked about internal comms. I wonder if you've got anything, sorts of words of wisdom around external comms, Darius, around how can we, within these change programs, support and garner that trust with our local residents, and to what extent does co-production factor into the advice that we give to our clients?
So in terms of the sort of first part, there is, of course, as we all know, no silver bullet to solve that lack of trust. It's something that is often built up over years, decades, or even, you know, in some instances a lifetime. And it's not something that similarly can be, you know, remedied in any short amount of time. What of course you can do is, which relates to change as a whole, is very much take that sort of Kaizen approach, where it's about small incremental changes applied over a sustained period of time to create that cumulative effect and benefit. So I've been lucky enough to coordinate and take part in community-based events where, you know, in some instances it's been place-based projects where it's about neighbourhood renewal or new community facilities, market halls, leisure facilities, that kind of thing. And they've been sort of politically and, of course, officer-led events, but also around sort of softer things where it was even sort of even getting to that stage where a vision hadn't been developed, and it was very much about asking the people what they actually wanted. Now, of course, you're always going to get sort of the interesting characters that turn up to events such as that. I'm sure we all have tales to tell. But nonetheless, it's really important to do that, and not to do it, like I say, silver bullet. Oh, well, we'll have a town hall meeting, we'll hire out the local theatre or conference hall or whatever it is, and we'll get everyone in the room and we'll show them the photoshopped images of what the new market hall is going to look like, and everything's going to be wonderful, and off we pop it, and that's the thing. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it's an earnest thing to do, and it's an opportunity for those who are sort of tuned in to come along and express an opinion, and also take on board new information in that Kaizen incremental sort of way. But what's really important, of course, is to do that in a continual way. So I always like to think of it in my head, it's almost like writing a soap opera. So whether it's EastEnders or Coronation Street, whatever, Emmerdale, whatever your preference or poison is, then I'm sure you all know, of course, that in each episode it opens by picking up where they left off from the previous episode, but also closes by opening up a new loop. There's always that cliffhanger, isn't there? And there are some almighty classics that are out there in terms of soap opera or whatever situational sort of programs that we all remember and talk about for months and years to come. And then there's that sort of more regular day-to-day. So everyone wants to tune in and they want to find out if Deirdre Rashid is going to be freed from prison, if you remember that from Coronation Street, or if Jack Duckworth has made it out alive, or whatever all these different ones are. I'm failing to draw any more relevant examples, I'm afraid, but I'm sure you get the point. And so it's very much obviously not quite as high drama, and we certainly don't advise pushing anyone in front of trams or false imprisonment or anything of that nature. But at the same time, it's about explaining where things are at the current time, being realistic and open and honest about that, whether you're at the we're asking you what you think, and we sort of have our opinion and we're going to combine that together, or if it's a little later down the path. And it's very much about sharing that vision and those sorts of artist impressions of it, assuming it's a place-based thing, or the different streams of funding and how that's going to be allocated out and that kind of thing. But also towards the end, in the middle and towards the end of any particular presentation or session, and of course it doesn't have to be a town hall or conference room sort of meeting, it can be via email, social media, all these different channels that are available to us now. But always to let them know why they should tune in again. Okay. So what's the reason? What's the reason to be keeping an eye on the inbox? What's the reason to come along to the next event? What's the reason to subscribe to the Twitter or Facebook feed or whatever it might be, or the RSS feed or the newsletter that the council might publish on a regular basis?
Thank you. I once had a resident write and try to perform a play called Housing Benefits in our customer services centre, bringing the soap opera right back to us. Thank you. We've allocated 45 minutes for this afternoon, beg your pardon, and we're sort of coming up to that mark now. So I thought I would wrap up with a bit of a summary of what we've talked about today, in terms of we've looked at sort of how I've termed it, doing the maths and talking to the humans. So we've looked at quantifying where we are in terms of our services. We've talked about creating the vision of a perfect service and mapping that against reality and seeing how much and to what extent we can bring reality and vision closer together. We've talked about complexity and bringing clarity to complexity through internal communications, amongst other things. We've talked about purpose and how it is the underlying driver of all the change that we need to make, that humans need purpose. We've talked about what will be different. We've talked about election cycles, and we've talked about decision making in an uncertain environment. We've talked about the new funding sort of paradigms that we're seeing in terms of central government dropping things on local authorities and how we can be ready and what obstacles we face there. And we've talked about residents, trees, orthodontists, social media and soap operas. So it's certainly been a variety of commentary today. So thank you very much. One thing I would say is watch out for the rest of the series that we have in terms of our change chats. They're around one every 6 weeks, and we love to have any contributions before, after, or during these conversations. We try to keep them informal. And the last thing I would mention is something Darius mentioned already in terms of the change readiness tool that we have for free on our website. Some of our clients and friends use it as a measure of their successes, and they like to dip into it every 2 to 3 months to see whether or not they've shifted the dial in any of the very key areas of change that tool gives you access to. In the emails that we'll send out after today, we'll drop a link in there. It's completely free, and you get a PDF download sent to your email within a couple of minutes. So we really encourage people to use it. We think it's great. Thank you very, very much to everybody who has attended this afternoon. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Friday and have an absolutely wonderful weekend. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Darius.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care all. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.